his relationship to Freud was very much a paternal, well, a child to a father, and this is known. Everybody knows this. Jung has admitted it. It's in the Freud-Jung letters. It's a fact of history that he had a very powerful father transference onto Freud, who didn't disabuse him of that particularly, to be fair. You could argue that that's a norm, if you like, for the way that the psychoanalytic method is used, that they do encourage parental transferences in order to uncover the neuroses latent in the person that they're working with.
So most of you guys have found Jung To Live By and the work of Steve and Pauline here through the Aion series that I did, or started about 2 years ago on the Uberboyo channel with Uberboyo himself. And it was very entertaining, it was good fun, and for seemingly no reason became incredibly popular. But, 2 years has passed in that time, 2 years of my own development under your mentorship, and so I think it's time very soon, not quite today, but very soon, to revisit this wonderful book and maybe give it a second look through. And so in order to prepare for that, what we're going to be doing is going through all of Carl Jung's collected works, except the general index, pretty much at the very, very end, to see which ones of those volumes are potentially worth visiting first, which ones are potentially not worth visiting whatsoever. And I think that would be a good video as well off the back of our previous one, our Depth Psychology Starter Kit, to give a general overview of, an orientation of where somebody can go in this field. And of course, it's worth noting as well that this is the Bollingen series of Jung's collected works. So of course, to start, where else would we start better than at the very, very
beginning? Yeah, thank you, James. Thanks for that. Just as a bit of a preamble to this, an issue everybody should have is starting with volume 9 part 2. In effect, this is the 10th volume in a linear sense in Jung's collected works in the Bollingen series. This has been popularised, I'm sure everybody knows that, on the internet, and a lot of people have read it, and in the context of their own life, some of them have gotten themselves into a bit of a mess because they don't understand the route that Jung travelled before he even got to that stage in his life. So as our series progresses, we're going to be looking at Jung's personal myth, we're going to be looking at how his ideas evolved, and to introduce this we're going to start with a brief introduction to the Bollingen series, as James has said. When we get to Aion, however, today that will be quite a superficial look at it, but we will be going in depth into that with Aion Revisited.
Yes.
And that will be an update, as James has said, on the series that he produced a couple of years back.
Yeah, it won't quite be 100 hours long like the previous one, but but no, I think it's very, very worthwhile doing, especially as I'm not sure about yourself and Pauline, but I get many questions still to this day about that particular series. It's because there's something in there that obviously holds weight for people. Yeah. So I think it does people justice. Yeah.
Well, to be honest, it doesn't have any. Our perspective is clinical, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. It has to be.
It has to be, and from a clinical perspective, Aion's not got any relevance at all, and that might be a bit of a shock to some people, particularly if their emphasis is on personal development. But really, people need to understand how Jung arrived at Aion, and then they're able to put it into its proper significance. So the place to start is not with Volume 9, Part 2, however important this may be. It is here, Volume 1, Psychiatric Studies. This is the foundation of Jung's work as a psychiatrist. It's hugely significant. Basically, it's built around Jung's doctoral thesis, which was on the psychology and psychopathology of so-called occult phenomenon. The absolute foundation, as I say, in psychiatric terms and in medical and psychotherapeutic terms of his work. So that is the place to start if you want to understand Jung. But then, of course, realise that Jung arrived at this place with his psyche and his personality pretty much already configured from his earlier life. And we'll be looking at some of the works to do with that as well. But if you're going to understand Jung as a clinician, you have to start here, without a doubt. So everything that you will need to know to give you the impression of how he's developed starts with that volume. So Psychiatric Studies, for sure. It's also a seminal work on the psychology, or the parapsychology actually, in terms of examining mediums, looking at dissociative phenomenon, hypnosis. You can see very clearly the influences of Jung's teachers such as Pierre Janet, who was the successor and equivalent of Jean-Martin Charcot, who was Freud's teacher at the Salpêtrière in Paris. Dissociation is such an important thing. Dissociation arises out of traumas, it arises out of complex activity, any kind of splitting in the psyche, and even the work of neuropsychoanalysis now in the 21st century is identifying this process as being really, really important. And this, as I say, is a seminal or foundational work in that. For those of you who are interested in hypnotic and parapsychological phenomenon, you will gain a great deal from reading that book. Ouija boards are in there, the planchette, table tilting, idiomotor phenomenon, all sorts of information. So start with this. Otherwise, again, this lacks its context. So for sure, go to this volume first.
Well, it's got a lot of the cool stuff, you could say,
Yeah.
that's in Aion, but it's starkly different, even the way
Yeah.
it's written. Because that's it. If you go straight to Aion, or even some of the other ones like Psychology, Alchemy, Mysterium, etc., you might think that Jung was a philosopher.
Yes.
I think that's what lots of people really think. And he was like a part-time philosopher in his spare time, but ultimately he was a clinician. And so, if you're interested in depth psychology as a field rather than a playground, then I concur, Steve. Start with that.
Oh yes, absolutely. He was a psychiatrist.
He was indeed. I mean, a couple of things come to mind as you're both talking. One is obviously if you go and work in a field like psychiatry and you go in with a fracture line, the chances are it will affect you.
Yeah, for sure.
For sure.
Yeah.
And we know that was likely to have been the case with Jung as well.
Yeah.
The other point I was going to make too is that we've actually explored all of those phenomena in our own clinical practice and on our courses.
Yeah.
So we're very familiar
Indeed.
with them and the kind of underlying processes at work.
Yeah.
So that's important too, because it gives you a practical handle on where Jung was coming from. And if you don't expose yourself to those things yourself, you don't really understand that.
No, absolutely. And people will come in, if you're a clinician, suffering from the influence of what they believe to be the occult, or even under the influence of stage hypnotists, or very, very poor hypnotherapists. And there are lots of them out there who, as there are poor psychotherapists who cause a great deal of damage to people. And when superstition sets in, then you find that the unconscious reacts in a typically paranormal or occult sense.
Yeah.
Although having said that, the paranormal is a common phenomenon when you work in depth.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're going to have a foundation, for example, in understanding synchronicity, you need to understand this. Because these things do conflate very, very closely. So it's a vitally important document. It's, as I say, foundational for parapsychology, foundational even for hypnosis in some sense as well. And particularly if you're of a Jungian or psychodynamic orientation and wish to use hypnotic methods in your practice. So,
of course, we know Jung had this in his background too because of his relationship to his mother.
Yes, indeed,
Tended to be superstitious.
Yes, she did.
And that obviously influenced his anima development and so on. And
yes.
You could see why he would be drawn to those kinds of things.
Yes. This was his foundational work, as I say, with respect to the Bergholzli, where he worked with Eugen Bleuler, who was the chief. He was an intern there, and he was working with unbuffered schizophrenics and psychotics of all kinds, people in a far worse state than those that Freud and Breuer were working with, who were ordinary, if I can use the expression, neurotics rather than psychotics. So when he first encountered them, he brought his earlier life with him, all of the superstitious elements from his mother, his own personal interests, all the things that you find in memories, dreams, reflections were pre-configured and ready to roll when he encountered people with those conditions. So it's absolutely foundational. Right, Volume 2, Experimental Researches. This is of particular importance really for Pauline and I. I'll just place it here. This was Jung's experimental psychology work. He also did it at Bergholzli. This was the book that got Sigmund Freud interested in Carl Jung. It's also a foundational work with respect to such things as the lie detector test because of Jung's use of physiological stress testing with a whole range of different people. It would include galvanized skin response, it would include blood pressure, and it would include movements of the chest wall and the abdomen with a machine called a pneumograph, which would show how people were breathing. In response to a series of stimulus words that formed what we call the Jung-Ricklin word association test. That's after Franz Ricklin, who was a collaborator at the Bergholzli with Jung, and after whom Franz Jung was named. He was a close professional colleague and friend of Carl Jung. So what we derive from that is the reality of complexes. That is so important, massively important, that they are psychophysiological, that they are psychosocial. And in a psychophysiological sense, Jung demonstrated how the psyche can download itself into the body and take form as physiological symptoms. Hugely important, and an extension of the work of Breuer and Freud in their work, Studies on Hysteria, from 1895. Jung sent a copy of this book to Freud, and that led to their collaboration. So again, in that sense, it's hugely important. The sad thing about it is that if Jung had continued with his work on complexes, there would have been no historical reason for the later development of behavioural and cognitive behavioural therapy. It would never have happened. The sad thing, as I say, is that as Jung moved away from this, so too did his later followers, and they've largely lost the skill of working with complexes, and yet complexes are the bread and butter of your work as a therapist. So it's a hugely important landmark volume yet again, and it also influenced Sigmund Freud to accept the notion of complexes. In 1909, when Freud went to America, to Clark University, to deliver a series of lectures, he took Jung with him and a number of other people as well, and in the papers published in the 5 essays volume of Freud's collected papers and works, he references Jung and Eugen Bleuler's work on complexes as being of great significance. When they subsequently split and parted, Jung started to drift away from the importance of instinct, and Freud started and in fact completely separated himself away from the notion of complexes. And we have suffered from that issue for the past 110 years at least. So it's a landmark volume. I would highly recommend it.
So at this stage in Jung's career, did he believe that mind and body were two sides of the same coin?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I know later on in his career, he explicitly says the opposite. It's in volume 18, there's the symbolic life, the symbolic or something he gives, and which is, again, if you put it in the context of what you've just said, how important the individual men are, the individual works are, and what's happened in terms of CBT being produced. It's like, as we introduced it in terms of Aion, it's like, oh dearie me, oh dearie, dearie, dearie me. Spoiler alert.
Yeah, indeed, absolutely. But if you want to understand mind-body relationships, this is an excellent source. And remember, this builds on Psychiatric Studies. If you're trying to understand Jung, you need to know these 2 volumes, along with the next 2, which will put you right in the frame of where Jung was at when he was working with Freud. And also you'll see the precursor to his breakdown, which he later called a creative illness. Other people regarded it as being a psychotic phase of his life, which perhaps he never fully recovered from. Controversial. But if you look at the evidence, you can come objectively, I hope, to your own perspective on that. But yeah, this is still good now. We still use the word association test, and we still use psychophysiological testing, and it's so clinically efficacious. You can get to things so quickly. And yet it's been largely forgotten, which is a huge shame. And I'm afraid that the fault of that is with Jung and with Freud.
It does make you wonder, though, if he hadn't been destabilised in the way that he was during his psychiatric days, that maybe history would have been different. It probably would have been.
Yeah, it would. It would. The psychodynamic movement would not have split. It would have been a whole body, mind-body and mind-body environment science, clinical science, the kind of thing that has been, we can say, revivified since the 1980s with the work of George Engel, Rossi, Mark Solms and ourselves. And there is a coming shift, a third wave of Jungians who are going to emerge. You had the original, and then you had the post-Jungians, and now there is a third wave of them coming, who are psychophysiologically and psychosocially, psychoculturally orientated. And we're part of that movement for sure, and it'll be great to see Freud and Jung brought back together within the overall framework of psychophysiology and neuroscience. It's about time that happened. Okay, this is volume 3, the Psychogenesis of Mental Disease. Again, this is a seminal volume and very, very important, both for Jung's development and for depth psychology as a whole. It's challenging in many respects. Amongst them is the notion that it is possible to bring about a mental disease from within the psyche itself, as opposed to it being a disorder of brain chemistry or of the effect of the environment, the usual psychiatric and psychosocial models. Jung challenges that by saying that the psyche is so autonomous in nature that it can actually create a disease within itself. There are problems with this, of course, and not everybody would agree with it. For example, Thomas Satz, the late Thomas Satz, a psychiatrist and someone trained in psychoanalysis originally, argued that it's not possible to have a mental disease because the mental processes, not being organic in his view, cannot have a disease as such. So the idea of a mental disease, it just doesn't work. And that's really been the view of psychiatry, subliminally, if not explicitly, probably for the past 100 years. They are very organic in nature with respect to how they look at problems, and basically it's a disorder of the endocrine system and of neurotransmitters or of hereditary, that kind of thing. But the psychogenesis, in other words, the origin of something like schizophrenia being purely psychological, that was challenging at the time, and it still is now, and it's a very, very moot point. Is it possible? I would argue yes, in some circumstances, so long as you remove this idea of mind and body being separate entities or separate things and look at it in a different way, which would be, is it possible to generate a psychotic state in yourself purely through the influence of your own psychology? Now, if it's phrased that way, I would say absolutely. You can definitely do that. And the mechanism is the same as it is in many, many other forms of psychological disorder, and that is suggestion. There are two broad kinds of suggestion. Auto-suggestion that you give to yourself, heterosuggestion that comes in from the environment, from others. Environmental suggestion can be in the form of influence from a significant figure, that could be in your personal environment, or further beyond that, out in the culture, through people that Jung called manner personalities, whom you see regularly today, for example, on the internet with internet entrepreneurs. Any kind of cultural factor or force can give you heterosuggestion, which you then take in, and then it can alter the way that you think and relate to your feelings and relate to your instincts, how you handle imagery, that kind of thing. And that definitely, through that form of suggestion and internal rumination and processing, I am quite satisfied can bring about psychotic states. They're not organic psychotic states, they're different, but they are nevertheless psychotic states. I mean, Paul and I, for example, know from our work and from the work of Alan and Agus in 1968 that you can hyperventilate yourself into a psychosis. And the problem with that is that once you've had the primary experience of doing that, you create a state, a whole mind, body, and perhaps social state, which you can replicate through autosuggestion later on. So even when the factors that created it initially are missing, you can pick up the memory of that, the perseveration of that, and activate it yourself by regenerating the associative state and creating it in yourself. And that's the kind of thing that Jung goes on about in this volume. So this links very closely with Experimental Researches, Volume 2, and Volume 1, Psychiatric Studies. This is so overlooked, and it's a huge mistake. Again, if you're going to follow Jung's model, you need to know about this, because by the time you arrive at Aion, and also those other volumes to do with alchemy, if you're not prepared, you're in danger of exposing yourself to ideas through suggestion, through the medium of Jung as an image now in the culture.
Yes.
And he's not doing it He's not doing this to you. You're doing it to yourself or through manner personalities, internet entrepreneurs, cultural structures and systems. The suggestion will take, and this can happen to you. And we know this because we work with people who've been affected by it.
Yep.
And we do day in and day out.
Pretty much every single day.
Pretty much every single day.
Well, Jung himself said about neurosis, not even psychosis, that we do recreate neurosis complexes every day.
Yes, he did.
We have to feed them afresh every single day to maintain them.
Yeah. You get up in the morning, he basically said, and
Yes.
you put them together. You reassemble
you
them through the associative process. And we now know that this is state-dependent memory, learning and behaviour. And that's from the work of Rossi, the late Ernest Rossi, Professor Ernest Rossi, who was a Jungian and a Freudian and a psychobiologist and an early supporter of our work. So vitally important, again, if you're making your journey to Aion, you need to follow the proper road. Volume 1, Psychiatric Studies. Volume 2, Experimental Researches, which will teach you about complexes. This one, Volume 3, The Psychogenesis of Mental Disease, you can see what you might do to yourself. If you're a clinician as well, this is a foundational text. And if you're a clinician, also see it in its proper context. Don't dismiss this as being some old-fashioned idea which ignores biology, ignores the effects of neurotransmitters, hereditary predispositions, an organic disease process in the brain. Just take all of that for granted. This is an addition to that gives you the background of how you can put yourself or one of your patients can put themselves in that state of being psychotic. And that's without the ingestion of substances, by the way, which a lot of people do. And it's the psychological effects of that result in the psychogenesis of a mental condition rather than a disease.
Yeah. Well, even psychiatry itself distinguishes between organic and inorganic states.
It does.
And those states that are labelled organic are sometimes, they become that way because of the iatrogenic effects of the medication, even more than the fact that the mental illness itself is some, a disease process.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's important to bear in mind as well, that if you are ingesting substances, whether they're legal or illegal substances, that in and of itself can create changes in the brain.
Yes, it can. And the classic text on that over the past 30 years is Toxic Psychiatry by Peter Breggin, that we will introduce in the next series that we do, the next podcast we do on essential reading. But you are quite right, they do look at things like that, but the fundamental psychiatric model being biomedical is that ultimately schizophrenia, for example, is organic. Psychosis is a very broad category, and some people are fortunate enough to have a very brief psychotic episode, and get back out again without too much damage being done to them in terms of a medical classification. But fundamentally the biomedical model is that it's organic. And then you have this philosophical position that you cannot have a mental disease, hence the title here, the psychogenesis of mental disease. You've also had, many of you may not have heard of him, Ronald Lang and his book The Divided Self, and his notion of the schizophrenogenic mother, that the psychosocial factors in the form of the relationship to improper, should we say, bonding to the mother can lead to schizophrenia. That's not popular anymore. It was in the 60s and 70s, but the organic model within psychiatry is gained ascendancy, partly because it's easy. It doesn't cost the psychiatrist anything to administer drugs and to classify people as having an organic brain state. So within that broader picture, you can look at this, obviously, but my own inclination would be to warn people, as that's the context of what we're doing today, of how you can bring this about in yourself through suggestion and influence from the environment.
There's potentially evidence for what you're saying in the neuropsychoanalytic literature as well, because I distinctly remember reading Mark Solms saying that the psyche is not produced from the brain in the same way that, say, like the liver will produce bile or something like that. There's a relationship between them, and they're highly connected, but it's not one leads to the other. That has to start at the beginning and move through to the end. So even though the neuropsychoanalysts are on the side of Freud, you could see a return then to Jung in that.
Absolutely, yes. Mark Solms talks about what he calls dual aspect monism. saying that brain and mind are actually the same thing, and it just depends on how you look at it, which technical language you wish to utilise. That, under another name, used to be called dialectical identity theory of mind. I was influenced in that in the 1980, 1981 by Professor Stephen Rose. That was his way of looking at things. So it's a return to that, and it's broadly a systems-based way of looking at things and understanding things. So the technical language you use is important. This was Jung's language based on the fact that he was influenced very heavily by the philosophical traditions of the 19th and even 18th century and earlier. And looking at the notion that the mind might be a separate thing or a separate substance. Certainly at a psychological level, the mind, the brain, the psyche can affect itself organically. It's easy to see how you can do that. You can just think yourself into a neurotic state. Anybody can do that. You can remember a stressful event in your life, and you can then have a perseveration of that in your body turning up as a stress reaction. So these interactions are going on all the time. So the psychogenesis of mental disorder, yeah, for sure. Mental disease, because that implies an organic issue, an organic pathology. Most people would reject that notion now. But the fundamental message of it is important. And I say, on your journey towards Aion, you need to read this and understand what you might be doing to yourself if you're not properly prepared. Okay, so volume 4, Freud and Psychoanalysis. This is an interesting volume for historical purposes, but don't let that put you off. History is very, very important. It gives you the context for understanding things. When Freud and Jung separated, it was a real separation. And I think it's fair to say that they didn't understand one another's work fully after that time. They had a good understanding of it up to the point where they departed, but they were more interested thereafter in developing their own ideas, so the vectors were separating quite markedly. So the account of Freud's work in this volume is more or less, even when it's material that was written after the separation, sometimes many, many years afterwards, is more of Jung's view of Freud's work as it was at the time that he was working with him, and earlier when he was working with Joseph Breuer. It is important because it gives us an angle on Jung's character and personality and his understanding of some of the most important conditions that were presenting at the time. For example, hysteria. Hysteria is not a common diagnosis these days, but that doesn't matter. What it really is, underneath any category used to describe it, still exists, and it's called different things these days. But the phenomenon, therefore, continues on, and you'll get a good understanding of his approach towards that, and it's essentially a critique of Freud from his perspective. You don't get a similar critique of Jung from Freud. So the energy gradient between them was very much from Jung towards Freud. Freud was quite content with himself. He was 19 years older than Jung, and Jung was trying to carve his own identity separately from Freud. Also, there were a cadre of people around Freud who actually set out comprehensively to ruin Jung's reputation, and to also do so for anybody else who defected from the early psychoanalytic circle. So in order to create his own model, Jung really had to push the boat out and declare himself as being something different. That's a matter of history as well in a wider context, but with respect to understanding Freud's work, you'll actually get more of an understanding of Jung by reading this, but it is part of his development, and it follows on from the previous 3 volumes. On your journey towards Aion, you need to know this, because Aion is part of Jung's personal myth. Okay, everybody, this is volume 5. This is the book that led to the separation between Jung and Freud. This is Symbols of Transformation. Originally, it was The Psychology of the Unconscious. This is a classical work. This is where Jung sets out his manifesto. Now, although it's commonly called, as I've just said, or referred to as being the book that led to the separation, that separation wasn't sudden. It was progressive over time, and Jung clearly had his doubts about how closely he could affiliate himself to Freud right from the beginning. His relationship to Freud was very much a paternal, well, a child to a father, and this is known. Everybody knows this. Jung has admitted it. It's in the Freud-Jung letters. It's a fact of history that he had a very powerful father transference onto Freud, who didn't disabuse him of that particularly, to be fair. You could argue that that's a norm, if you like, for the way that the psychoanalytic method is used, that they do encourage parental transferences in order to uncover the neuroses latent in the person that they're working with. And Freud and Jung did work together, not in a strict analytical sense with one another, but they did exchange dreams, they exchanged associations, and during that process it was very much the case that Jung had to zip himself up into the Freudian body bag, if you like, and say that, yes, I'm interpreting according to psychoanalysis and everything's wonderful and it's just right. And at the same time he was biting his lip really, really hard, because he thought that he had experienced things in his psychiatric work at the Berg Holsley that Freud did not understand. That was pretty much the motivation for what he was doing. And he thought that his work on complexes, as in Experimental Researches, Volume 2 of the collected works, had proven this fact, that there were other factors at work in the psyche. And principally these had to do with how he saw mythological symbols and narratives arising in the symptoms and fantasies of unbuffered psychotics and schizophrenics. Now, I think what we can say for sure is that this is true, that you will see it in people who are psychotic.
Oh, you do, absolutely. Even when they're buffered, actually.
And even when they're buffered, yeah. But perhaps how much more so when they're not.
Yes, of course, yeah. It's a matter of degree, yeah.
It's a matter of degree. And Jung reached out, or tried to reach out, towards what he perceived to be an organising centre within the psyche of people like that was systematising things and making sense of it. And he applied his theory of complexes to psychosis, and believed that schizophrenia, or dementia praecox as it was called earlier on in the 20th century, late 19th century, was essentially caused by complexes, hence the Psychogenesis of mental disease in volume 3 of the collected works. Now, he began to move away from Freud's model altogether. That meant that he separated from an appreciation, understanding, or even desire to promote the idea of instincts, and instead he looked at what he believed to be archetypes, and that came up to be his theory. And Freud simply could not agree with it, although he did later accept that there were things that he called archaic remnants in the collective psyche of everyone that pointed to a primitive evolutionary adaptation to the world, and that these things would emerge from the unconscious. But Freud did not elaborate it to anything like the extent that you find in here. This is elaborate. And this, if you like, is the beginning of what you will find in Aion. However, there is something very important to understand. Around the time that he was putting this together, he was pulling himself apart into his creative illness, as he calls it. He was becoming psychotic, as if you like, as he was writing this book. And of course he started to write the Red Book and all the other things that he was doing, his work with Tony Wolff, and you can call it his descent into the unconscious, or his confrontation with the unconscious, his creative illness, whatever. Out of the context of who he was, with the social status that he had, the role that he had as a psychiatrist, he probably would have been sectioned himself. That's important to understand. When you think back to the psychogenesis of mental disease, then you can see again, as Pauline said earlier, that the exposure to these people, these poor people who were suffering in the Berg Holsley, probably opened up the fracture line that was present already. Yeah. Before he went into that environment. The result was his creative illness and his attempt to ground himself firstly with this as a professional statement and a declaration of independence from Freud, and then he began to go quietly mad. So again, on your road to Aion, don't make it a road to Damascus, don't make it a road to Basra and destroy yourself on the way. And I say don't make it a road to Damascus because, you know, Paul may have thought that he had an enlightenment there, but again, if someone produced that kind of symbolism today in the street, they would be sectioned. You're not St. Paul. Remember that. So be very, very careful about how you deal with this material. Don't expose yourself to it. It's not something to be frightened of, but you need to look at the primary sources that Jung was looking at. You need to look at mythology, comparative religion, anthropology, but update it, because some of Jung's ideas weren't right. I won't go into detail about that because it would take too long, but you need to look at that and understand it, and particularly look at how anthropology deals with collective representations of images and symbols, rather necessarily than Jung. Although in understanding Jung, you will have to confront these other ideas, these other interpretations of Jung's material, because if you go too far that way, you will literally follow him into the so-called abyss. So be careful.
I could say as well, obviously there's spoke about volume 2 there of the collected works, and you've also got a playlist on complexes on the YouTube channel. It's probably a good idea to go to those as well first.
Yes, it is.
Because I was thinking about how, obviously he's writing about complexes, and then Jung produces this series of works which can generate complexes in people, and we know that, at least I know that from the DMs I've been receiving from people who've watched, say, the Aion series, and it's like, well, how could he go from there to there? It doesn't make any sense. But that in many ways should be the point of visiting something like Aion. So you don't make the same kind of mistake. It's an exercise in depth psychology itself to understand it, rather than the big mystical ideas itself. So yeah, I second you, Steve. Be careful, because I know what it's like.
Can I just add something to that, James, as well? That Jung would have known if he hadn't have been able to get a handle on what was happening to him. And obviously, you know, he was surrounded by people. He was fortunate enough to be surrounded by people who could maybe assist him and help him through those times. But he would have known too that had he not been able to do that, that someone like the Bergholzli would have been his fate as well.
Yes, it would.
He would have absolutely known that. So he probably drew on all the resources that he had to tackle what he was going through in a different way. And I guess the value of Jung here, and I certainly found that when I was working in psychiatry, is that idea of giving meaning to suffering, of it being a creative illness, because that is so opposed really to the biomedical view of things, that it is a perspective and a valuable perspective. But as I say, he would have known, had he not been able to address things differently, that he would have gone the way of those poor people who were in there and, like you say, unbuffered, and he would have known his fate.
Oh, he would. Yeah, that's a really good point to emphasise. And a lot of people these days don't understand that will be their fate if they're not careful.
If they dabble in this and they get themselves sectioned.
Yeah, it's not nice, is it?
No, it isn't.
You may have ECT waiting for you. Amongst other things, you may have a very, very long course of SSRIs from which you may not be able to escape waiting for you. And given the pressure in the environment and the culture at the moment, those cultural pressures, you know, if you have any fracture line at all, you'll be open to the suggestion of those cultural forces and pressures, and that might cause an issue. So you have to be really, really careful about that.
Just like he was. Exactly the same dynamic, isn't it?
Exactly the same. So be very, very careful about imitating Jung in any sense at all, because you might literally go that way and not be able to pull yourself back. There are people on the internet, they're well known, who have exposed themselves to these ideas and they're in a mess. It's not difficult to see how that's happened, particularly if you understand the context of their life, in other words, of their personal mythology, and see how that's worked negatively for them. Okay, everybody, this is one of the famous ones, Volume 6, Psychological Types. This is, again, a very, very important work. And what we're left with today is the Myers-Briggs in one form or another. Either the Myers-Briggs as it presents today, or the different variations of it in the past, and then the ramifications off from it where people have tried to modify it, develop it, or whatever. But fundamentally, the Myers-Briggs is the dominant form of Jungian-based psychological testing in the world. It's the most popular personality test ever, bar none, and it will probably remain that way because it's so well marketed, and in the sense that it appears to give some kind of reward, if you like, for the people who take it. There are issues over its test, retest and construct validity. I'd be happy to look at that again with Pauline and with James. Some of the criticisms are valid, some are not, because they don't understand the underlying theory of it. However, all of that said, and going back to the book, this book has nothing in and of itself to do with Myers-Briggs. Nothing. Jung never validated it, never commented upon it. This is all about why Jung created his theory of types, and it's all about Jung. It's not about anybody else particularly, except his relationship to Freud and to Alfred Adler. He wanted to understand why his model had turned out differently to Freud's and also Adler, and he says so in this book. This is a slight aside, but it does have relevance. This is published as Jung on Elementary Psychology, a discussion between C.G. Jung and Richard L. Evans, who was a professor of psychology at Houston. This is available as a video series of interviews. Many people have probably seen it on YouTube. And Jung is very clear about how his typological model came into being. What you get in here are, I would say, I don't know if you'd agree, Paul, you actually, what you see in here is what you actually see in the real world.
Yes, I'd agree. Yeah.
As opposed to how it's distorted by the various type tests.
Yes. And you do see something very different in the real world.
You do.
You do.
You do indeed. You do see, for example, people who are pure attitude types.
Definitely.
And you can't really distinguish whether they are thinking, feeling, sensing or intuitive. They're just extroverted or introverted. And that's it. And they'll be moving very quickly between the different so-called, these days, cognitive functions. Jung didn't call them cognitive functions himself. You'll then see somebody who is, say, a thinking type in one of those attitudes, introverted or extroverted, but you can't really say anything else about them. There's no clear so-called auxiliary function, tertiary or inferior function. Jung does talk about those things, but he does also talk about these pure types, and that's why it's important not to skip over that and look at the other things, because that's somehow, you can blend that with Myers-Briggs or any one of its variations. So yeah, it's important to understand then that the only purpose of this book was for Jung to try to understand himself. That was it. Everything else after that was an add-on to that primary thing, which was, why have I come up with my model? And he came up with the solution, which was echoed, if you like, from Nietzsche, because Nietzsche himself suggested that, you know, all schools of philosophy were personal statements. Jung said that all schools of psychology were personal statements of their founders too. In other words, it was their personal myth, their personal equation. He regarded Freud as being a sensing type and also a feeling type. He regarded himself as being predominantly thinking, backed up by intuition, and that he was introverted. He didn't say that his intuition, for example, was extroverted. He just said, you know, I'm an introverted type and I'm characterised by thinking, and then secondarily by intuition. That's all he said. But people have tried to twist that to fit a Myers-Briggs program, either INTP or INTJ, whatever. He didn't say that about himself. And if anybody understood his own theory, surely it was him, better than anybody else. So again, go here before you go near Aion, and add this to all the previous volumes and put it into context. There's a Jungian type test, the original, the grey wheelwright.
Yes, I was just thinking about that actually, because we were talking about Joe Wheelwright the other day.
We were. On an earlier podcast that we did. He doesn't, in his test, measure the J and the P function at all. You are an attitude type and you have a dominant and an auxiliary function. But he doesn't provide the fourth letter. There are 3 letters, and that's very close to how Jung himself describes things here. In the real world, it gets very, very complicated. Far more complicated than the complexity upon complexity even than you get with Myers-Briggs and its various ramifications. Because you're dealing with real people, you're not dealing with abstractions that you overlay grid-like upon a real human being and distort them into this very neat quaternity, which Jung was very fond of course, shape between the different so-called functions. There's more to it than that, of course. He does go into depth about the balance between functions, but I'm emphasising the things that people don't normally emphasise, that are overlooked, because you'll learn far more there than perhaps you might think that you will.
Well, if you watch somebody like Joe Wheelwright speaking, the takeaway from that is that you see somebody who has a kind of warm intuition, but beyond that, can you be any more specific? I think not, personally. And that's what you see empirically.
Yeah.
There's somebody with lots and lots of ideas, but he's very warm and very effusive and has good rapport with people.
Yeah.
And it's as if those two things are conjoined.
And are both extroverted.
And are both they're both delivered in that way. So how can that be?
Yeah.
If you stick to a rigid model of things.
Yeah,
but that's what you see.
That's what you see, because according to Myers-Briggs, his intuition should be introverted, and it isn't.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it gets you thinking, if
It
nothing
does.
else.
It does.
Yeah.
So another landmark volume. If you believe in the Myers-Briggs, that's fine. That's up to you. But this should be a starting point, and then test Myers-Briggs against this, and then more importantly against real life, without imposing a theory upon the people that you encounter.
You two always confuse me with type. Is this the one topic you always confuse me on? Because 1 minute it's like, well, his classic Myers-Briggs, and the next it's like, it's all fake, it doesn't exist, and the world is a lie.
I think there is value in it, James. I really do. We kind of play devil's advocate a bit because people get so hooked up on categories. But if you'd have been steeped in the grey wheelwright and not in the MBTI, you've never known about the MBTI, you would have a different perspective on it. But I think in broad terms, there's definitely something in it, without a doubt.
Yes. So what could you then slot Mr. Wheelwright into one of those? If he was an IPSA student and he came along, or would you be like, you just present as you present and you're a bit of a weirdo?
He would, in his typology, he would be. We're going to include this?
Might as well, yeah.
Yeah. In his typology, he would be EUF. They call intuition
That's
U.
right. They use the U in the word intuition.
Yes, you'd get the attitude letter at the beginning. In his case, it would be an E followed by a U and then F. But it wouldn't say which of those was dominant or auxiliary, because they're both in that attitude type, and that was the important thing. And it's what you see with him, and you'll see that with other people as well, won't you, very often.
So what in your model of typology, would you give him a series of letters, or would you just leave it and just say
I'd have to it's a good question. I'm sorry we didn't answer it. I would say he is what he is, and if we force him into ENFJ or ENFP,
well, that's the direction in which you'd have to go if you wanted to fit him into
and that's a distortion.
MBTI.
That's a distortion.
Yeah.
Probably ENFJ.
You'd have to say that he moves between the two, wouldn't you? That's the only other way you could explain it. That sometimes, functionally he's an ENFJ, and other times functionally he's an ENFP.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's included in like the lecture or the seminars that we give to the IPSA students.
Yeah.
So okay.
Yes. Yeah. But it simplifies things.
Yes.
To think of it, in the way that you've just described, Steve, doesn't it? With the U and the F.
Yeah, he's an attitude type with preference for two functions.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah.
Because that's what you see. But that's not a Myers-Briggs diagnosis, if you like, or classification. It just doesn't happen. No. And any further elaboration by saying he's got an inner demon and a what? Forget it. Yeah. Please, just get real and have a real life. I pressed a button on myself then. Did you notice that? Also suggestion, press the button, Anyway.
I mean, there's no doubt complexes play a part. And sometimes complexes answer type tests on your behalf.
Yeah.
That is true.
Yes.
Which I think is a useful elaboration of things. But to go into, like you say, all the trickster and demon stuff and that is just getting away from the point.
Yeah. This is a very, very important book. 2 essays, it's called, long essays. 2 essays on analytical psychology. Within that, you're getting the systematisation in a very familiar way to most people probably with Jung's model, but you're also getting something of a summary of where he's come up to this point. He discusses the Eros theory, which is Freud, and then the will to power, which is Adler, the other point of view, as he describes it. And then he goes on about his theory of the unconscious and typology. And so this is a really good place to go at this point in the journey on the road to Aion, because you can see how Jung's ideas have become comfortable to him, and he's crystallised out what would become his benchmark approach and understanding of things. So it's whence he's come from and whither he is going is all prefigured and configured within this particular volume. So it's interesting. It's not the place to start, though. Not the place to start. You do need to start with volume 1. So 2 essays on analytical psychology. Again, a very important volume.
One of my favourites, actually.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yes. It's very useful for going in and finding definitions for things as well. It's very, very grounding work. You talk about ego inflation and things like that in there as well. There's bits on the anima and the animus as well. It's good. It's not too long either.
No, it's not. It's not too long. So, as I was suggesting, it's a crystallisation of his model and what he's developed up until that point. So yeah, it's good, but if you start with that, it's decontextualised.
It would be. A lot would also put you off in there as well.
Yeah.
Especially some of the more historical stuff that's just dropped on top of you.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But it's a good volume. One of my favourites too, actually. But it was.
Get that on a t-shirt.
Well, it was one of my favourites. Or it was.
2 essays on Analytical Psychology Club. Represent.
Yeah. Okay guys, The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, Volume 8. This follows on very nicely from Volume 7. It builds upon it. You'll get things in here, concepts in here like synchronicity. There's a review of complex theory. There's so much that's of value for the serious Jungian scholar and even for a Jungian therapist or a Jungian based therapist in here, provided that you also understand everything that's gone before. But yes, it is a good volume. Without going into great detail, because it is a thick volume, as I say, most of the major topics are covered in here. But again, this is all before Aion. If you miss this out and go straight to Aion, you're lost. You may as well be wandering in a desert for 40 years.
Yes.
Led by some internet prophet. Before you wake up and realise you've been going in the wrong direction. So you need these previous 8 volumes even before you get onto volume 9 part 1, which again is an essential precursor to Aion. But this builds on volume 7, and again it covers many of the foundational issues, such as the soul and death, for example, the idea about reincarnation, or all of the really deep stuff that Jung was into, that has meaning in that sense for people who are searching for meaning in their life. So yes, I would definitely recommend this. In fact, in my view, it's a better, more practical and more usable work than Aion itself. Far and away better, if you're of a Jungian orientation. Okay everybody, Volume 9 Part 1, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious.
People often get that name wrong, by the way. It's very rare people get it right. People normally say the archetypes of the collective unconscious.
Yes.
Yes, you're right, they do.
Yeah. Well, people get a lot of things wrong, don't they? That's unfortunately why we're doing this. Anyway, within here you will get individuation spelt out. You'll get the use of mandalas. Everything which again is a continuation of what we had in Volume 8 and Volume 7. Everything flows logically up until this point. Aion is a departure. But if you're not prepared by understanding this and you're determined to go into Aion, you will be missing something. So don't start with it. Don't start with Aion. And I keep repeating myself on that. But this is important if you are a person who is just interested in Jung from a philosophical perspective. If you're a psychotherapist, to be honest, in the real world, this is beginning to go into the infrared and then out of sight because of the spectrum of reality in terms of working with people. Mandalas, yes, you can work with them. Yes, individuation is a real thing, but the way that they're described and resolved down by Jung into a specific perspective is highly individual to this man and his journey. You must understand that.
It was his containing vessel for his own illness, wasn't it, really?
Yes,
it has to be seen in that way.
Yes, it was. It's the product of everything that went before it. And this is a precursor to Aion in the same sense that John the Baptist was to Jesus. This predicts Aion. This is like building up to the point where Aion becomes necessary for him, almost like a catharsis with respect to his relationship to his father, and particularly to his religious complex, which he got from his father, which works itself through in Aion. So that's what's meant about it going into the infrared and about to disappear away from practical reality. There are some practical things in here, but they're overlaboured. To take mandalas out of the originating culture does do some violence to them. It does. And I know he discusses them in the originating culture, but Jungians interpret that differently. They use the original culture as a justification for what they do with mandalas, and that's where they can be criticised. Basically on the epistemological foundation of what they're doing. That's a discussion for another day, because we would have to go into it very deeply. But basically the message is build upon everything that went before and see this as John the Baptist to Aion's Jesus. This is the precursor. This is the work that people will sometimes ignore in the rush to get to Aion for whatever reason.
I'm quite fond of that work, to be honest, Steve. Not for any clinical reason, but it's what you would think classic Jung would be.
Oh, yes, it
him
is.
in the culture. But then that's also the problem, because somebody's immediate presumption of what Jung would be, for example, this does come from the way his name is put about all over the place.
It does, yeah.
And so I guess to sort of wrap up this particular, like part one of this particular series, it's like that's what we're trying to do with this, is to buffer people against the, quite frankly, dangerous complexes that can be formed through exposure to these material. Because Jung, as a man and a clinician, who as a normal human being who lived his own life in his own time, suddenly becomes... Well, you've got Joseph Campbell, who inspired George Lucas, and then Star Wars comes out of that, and then you've got someone like Jordan Peterson coming out of the culture and saying, look at this, here's Aion, isn't everything so strange? It's like, no, not necessary. And I think, even though this is entertaining, I think the beauty of Jung is in those early works, because that actually makes a difference.
It does, and... Not everybody wants to be a therapist, but lots of people are trying to be a self-therapist.
Yes.
And that's what personal development is all about, is that you're doing therapy on yourself. That can only go so far, though, before you have to work with other people to escape from yourself. And the inflation that comes about quite naturally from working too much on yourself, and particularly if you borrow a corpus of work like this and interject it in, what are you bringing with it? Unless you work with other people, you can't test your own hypothesis of yourself against anything. There's no objective relationship or personality. This is not a person. It's a book. It's not the personality. It gives you an impression of it, but it is not Jung himself. It's just some of his writings bundled together that exist in the culture that you can refer to, but how you refer to it is key to how you navigate through that. So if you're into personal development, which is self-therapy, you will only get so far with that, and you will inevitably move towards being a philosopher. And that's a trap in and of itself, particularly the way that philosophy has been for the past 300 years in the West. We see a lot of people who are failed or misfired philosophers, and that term misfired philosopher is one that Jung used himself. And that many philosophers are actually misfired psychologists. He also said that. So if you're going to follow Jung, you have to criticise yourself, you have to criticise your own worldview, and you have to criticise Jung as well within his context. That will give you some protection against what can be scooped up with these kind of ideas and pulled in. So there we go. The first part of our surface structure analysis of the Bollinger series of Jung's collected works. Then we will approach Aion, ready for the Aion Revisited series, courtesy of James. But we have something else to discuss as well, don't we?
Yes, we do. We do indeed. We started Jung To Live By back in February or so. And since then, it's grown to be quite a substantial community, especially over on the Discord server. And of course, in the YouTube comments as well. I really like it. I really, really like it. So thank you, everyone, of course, for not just tuning in, but helping to support us. And so the most highly requested thing by far ever on the channel is for a full explication of the personal myth. And so that's what you're working very hard on at the moment, Steve, is a full guide, the ultimate handbook, one might say, on how you can do the ultimate form of self-analysis. Now, I don't want to inflate you, because obviously we've been talking about protecting ourselves from that kind of thing. But I do think in many ways it's what psychotherapy has been waiting for. Many figures come along to try and distill ideas down and bring it into the reach of ordinary people, you might say. But that was your two's promise to Franz Jung back in 1992.
Yes.
So you're doing it with the films, but it's like, well, how are you going to do that elsewhere, where you've got these podcasts, but also how do you take the most healing parts of the psychotherapeutic canon to give to somebody else in a safe containing vessel that they can actually use to be useful?
Yes.
And so that's what this attempt is. And from
Yeah.
what I've seen and heard so far, it's looking very, very good.
Yeah, it's the distillation of real-world practice for ordinary people who've never heard of Carl Jung. This is where this experience originated, and didn't want to know about Carl Jung, but who were suffering and had suffered terribly in their lives. They can still access this approach to personal mythology, but the guide will have an analysis of Jung's personal myth at the end. So for those of you who are followers of Jung's work, it will give you a dialectical prompt to test yourself against and reject what's in there if you wish. By all means, please do. But the invitation will be for you to pressure test yourself against these ideas which have been distilled out of over 40 years of personal experience working with people in the real world. That's hugely important. The first part of it is going to be how to do it in the real world. The middle part is going to be all of the theory that you need to understand and to test against to see whether the theory itself holds any water. The theory being the justification for the real world practice. Then at the end there's Jung's personal myth and an analysis of that. So put together, that'll be a pretty effective document.
So you can, if you're watching now in the present moment-ish, then you can pre-order the guide at the current time through the link in the description down below. Or if you're a visitor from the future, hello, it will already be released. So there's no need to worry and wait. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you next time.
The Personal Myth Ultimate Handbook is now available for pre-order for release on January 7th, 2021. For anyone who has a yearning deep in their very genome to become who they truly feel they should be, this guide is utterly indispensable. Pick up your copy today and make 2021 the year you truly begin to become yourself.